Welcome to the Leading Real Change podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jacqueline Kerr, an expert in workplace culture change. From my unique background in behavior science, public health, and community advocacy, I help corporate leaders with evidence-based individual, team, and organizational change to create thriving workplace cultures for all. In the Leading Real Change podcast, I interview dedicated and passionate change makers about their careers, how they lead change, and what leaders can do today to make a difference, to build healthy, inclusive workplace cultures for all. I'm excited to share these examples of real workplace change with you. You'll learn about effective strategies that are working and how to overcome real barriers to change that challenge us every day. I hope you'll feel inspired and more confident to keep leading change in your workplace. Please share this podcast with other HR, DEI, or ERG leaders who you know are working hard but are struggling to have an impact and need more support to effectively create a thriving workplace culture for all today.
Katica Roy. I'm the CEO and founder of Pipeline and an award-winning gender economist. And my favorite hobby is running, and I'm a big Peloton person.
Oh, interesting.
I have all the machines. I do it every day. I don't run every day, but I do Peloton every day.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and I'm a runner and still trying to be a runner. I think I'm sometimes a shuffler these days.
If you run, you're a runner. I just own it. Yeah, it's good. It is central for me, my mindset and doing the work I do.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that because, again, that's a little bit the background I came from was in public health and exercise in particular as something that's so important for our physical and mental health as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think for me, it helps on so many levels, but also just the pushing through. By the time I get to my desk, I've already gone for a run or lifted weights or whatever is on the schedule that day. And so the day is already a success before I ever even get to my desk.
And do you find you have your best ideas while running or in the shower afterwards?
Sometimes. That used to be true. Definitely not at my desk, but I think not so much on when I'm running, but I would say it definitely has helped me like push through and not get sucked down. You know what I mean? There's a lot of like rejection in the work in general, but also in the work, being a startup founder, being a female founder, doing the work that I do. And I think being able to push through that and start my day off in the right mindset, it makes a huge difference.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. And I know I struggled myself when my runs became stressful because I got a new dog and it was this crazy puppy. And suddenly I didn't have my stress management that I had. And it impacted me so badly. So it made me realize how important my runs are to me too.
Yeah. And my kids know that's my time. Unless the house is burning down, please don't bother me.
That's so interesting too, because I remember it was really hard for me to accept this when my husband said to me, when I said, I don't have any time for myself. And he goes, you have the half hour you take every morning for a run. And I was like, oh, that's it. That's all I'm allowed. And it was just devastating.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah. And I think you have to put yourself first. It's that whole thing of you have to put your oxygen mask on first. You can't give what you don't have. And if you don't fill your own bucket, you can't fill someone else's.
Exactly. It was a hard lesson, but I eventually learned it. So tell me a little more about your career path and how did gender equity become your focus?
There's really three pieces to how I ended up doing what I do. One is my family history. The second is my place in my family. And the third is my experience in the workforce. My family history is that I'm the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. My mom was an immigrant. She was actually born on Guernsey, one of the Channel Isles of Britain, in 1939, the year that World War II began. And in 1940, when France fell to the German army, Prime Minister Churchill doubted his ability to defend the Channel Isles, and so he evacuated them. And my mom was one of the 5,000 children that were evacuated. She was on the last ship off. She was the youngest of 5 children, and she was separated from her mom and 4 siblings, placed into an orphanage, and adopted a year later. And when she was 21 and an emancipated adult, she actually came to the United States. She immigrated here for equality and opportunity. My father was a refugee. He escaped from Hungary after the fall of the 1956 revolution. And with the help of Hungarian freedom fighters, he, along with my 3 eldest siblings, who were 3, 7, and 8 at the time, walked across a minefield, crossed the border into Austria, and arrived to a refugee camp. And less than 2 months into their stay at the refugee camp, President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the US on Christmas Day, 1956, and they were on that plane. So really that first piece for me of how I ended up doing what I do is that it was because of one person in a position of power, who in this case was President Eisenhower, that I'm here with you, who said, not on my watch, this will not happen. And that's why I'm here having a conversation with you and why I ultimately founded Pipeline. The second piece of my career path is really my place in my family. So I'm the youngest of 6 kids, 5 girls. And much of the things that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg fought for in her career were things that I saw play out in my sisters' lives. So things like you couldn't get a business loan without a male cosigner. You couldn't get a credit card without a male cosigner. And I saw this play out and impact not only my sisters, but their children, really their economic opportunity. Just as one example, my eldest sister came here when she was 8 years old, came to the United States. She didn't speak any English. And 10 years later, she graduated as the valedictorian of her high school class. So these were not people who suffered for intelligence, they suffered for equity of opportunity. So that was the second. And then the last piece is that I'm a breadwinner mom for a family of 4, and I fought to be paid equitably twice and won. And I didn't file a lawsuit. I just simply knew how to do the research and spoke up for myself. And I had gotten the same education as everyone else, and in some cases, actually more education, but didn't have equity of opportunity. And I think given my experience, I knew 2 things. One was that gender equity had to be based in economics. So not as the right thing to do, but as a massive economic opportunity and how to quantify that. And then the second is really, how do you embed that within the decisions that companies are already making about their people? And if you can do those 2 things, you can really catapult companies and ultimately our economy toward equity.
Great. Thank you so much for that background. And I do love all the historical references there as well. I know I recently read a story that was based on Guernsey too, so I had heard a little bit more about that background too, coming from the UK myself. Yeah, I think that's just great. The 2 things you're saying there about basing it in economics, I think that's the thing, not just that this is a business advantage and so important for business. There is business cases for this, but I think also that there are economic cases for this in the wider economy. But also then too, that it comes down to decision making, because that's the perspective I come from as well, from a public health background, where we're impacted by our own mindset that we talked about, having a run and getting ready to face difficult days. But we're influenced by those around us. We're influenced by our organizations and then society at large and government and policies. And what I really understood when I was doing this work, where sometimes I was empowering communities, other times I was trying to meet with policymakers. And all the time it was this case of realizing this is all people making decisions on a daily basis. This is not like a system. I feel like so often we talk about systemic problems and systems problems as if there's something we have no influence over or can't control or just is beyond us. But yet it is just humans making decisions every day. So I really think that focus is so important. And really, so is economics. We always think that is also like this out of touch, unwieldy, uncontrollable process. It's not. It's people making decisions every day. And we have choices.
The mindset piece works and is important, don't get me wrong. And it's half the story. And what I mean by that is that our system is inequitable by default, not equitable by design. So we often tell little girls, I was of this generation, that if they work hard and do well in school, they can be anything they want to be. And then they arrive to the workplace and they're like, wait a second, this is not equitable. And then we try and focus on fixing women than fixing the system that doesn't value them equitably. And so the mindset piece is important. And what's also important is that we tell women and girls the truth, which is that the system doesn't value them equitably. And so they should walk into that knowing that it doesn't. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I have a daughter. I have two kids, a son and a daughter. And my daughter is my youngest. And when she was little, people used to say, and this didn't happen to my son, and he is good looking, but they used to say to my daughter, oh, she's so cute. And I would reply before she could speak, and she's smart too. And then I taught her to say that so that whenever she was complimented on her looks, the automatic rewiring in her brain was that she was smart too. So that's one example. And the second example is that we taught our daughter that her words matter and they have value, and she's not to be interrupted. So if you're talking to her, even us, and you interrupt her, she will say, excuse me, I'm speaking. And she'll say that until you stop talking and listen to her. And so these are some of the things that we don't tell women and girls, and we need to as they go into the workplace.
Oh, that's so important. I love those two lessons because, again, it is part of that giving our kids the confidence to do that growing up so that by the time they get into these difficult situations, they've done it in the safety of the home and then expanded it to other places. And then in the workplace, they have the confidence to do that.
And they don't think it's themselves. They don't think that it's somehow like they're lacking. The first time I fought to be paid equitably, I had this moment. I was an undergrad. I was a political science major, legal studies emphasis undergrad. And so obviously I'd learned about women's rights. And I'd been involved in different organizations in my 20s. And then I really turned my focus to building my career. I really didn't think it was much of an issue. Of course, experience is a great teacher. But I remember the first time I fought to be paid equitably. And when I discovered basically what happened, it was when I was on maternity leave with my daughter. And my boss was optimized, which is a fancy word for fired. And when I got back from maternity leave, I had a team I was managing, and I was asked to take on a new team. And then 2 weeks later, a third team. So it was a great opportunity for a breadwinner mom for a family of 4. The issue was my male colleague took on one additional team. He was also one pay grade higher than I was, and he got additional compensation for that new team. I didn't get anything. And so when I called HR and my new boss, and I was like, this is a great opportunity. How do you want to make me whole on my compensation? They said nothing. And so there was a couple of months there where I did research and I was talking to them. But it was also this, like, both the mental gymnastics of speaking up and understanding that retaliation is real. And also there was a process by which, and this is the disservice we do to women and girls, that I thought, oh my gosh, is this because I'm not a good negotiator? And I'm a great negotiator. This was not my fault. And so I think that, and then eventually I did speak up and say, look, this is the Lily Ledbetter issue. Every time you pay me, the statute of limitations starts over. And they gave me back pay and increased my compensation. But I think we do this disservice where we don't tell women and girls, you're going to face these things. Here's the strategies for how to deal with them, so that their immediate reaction when that happens isn't, oh, I did something wrong or I'm not valuable. It's, oh, you don't value me. Here's my strategy to overcome that.
Yeah, I love that so much. There's so many things in what you've just been saying there. I think the I to you, it is so important. And again, I've seen that framing in Kim Scott's work when she very much says that when we're trying to interrupt bullying or harassment in the workplace, we turn the focus to you instead of the I. But I think that's also the other piece, because I just recently had read When Women Lead by Julia Boston. And at the end of that, she realizes herself that beyond the serenity prayer, where you can control what you can control, you need to understand what are the barriers so you can overcome them. But I think what you've done is go a step further than that, that there's nothing wrong with me. This is you, and this is the system that's the problem, because I think we still carry so much guilt and so many things. And for me, also this tell the girls the truth, because for me, I felt like I was just always fighting a shadow. Like I could not work out, why was I having to work so much harder? Again, assuming that this was partly my own fault, and then not actually able to see it. And it wasn't till then, when I burnt out myself, left academia, started researching how to fix myself, how to become a better mom, better parent, better manager. And on the better manager path, I started to learn about the maternal wall and the motherhood penalty. And I felt so ignorant. I was like, how did I not know about these things? And it wasn't till, again, speaking with another colleague in this field, she goes, oh yeah, I didn't know it till I hit it, and I couldn't get rehired back to my old company at the same rate, or any company. And so it was so frustrating to us, because like you said, we had really believed the message that our hard work will overcome any barrier, and we didn't actually know what barriers we were going to hit up against. And so that was so frustrating. But it also makes me think too about some of the conversations I've been having with younger women about burnout, and particularly younger women going into university positions, whether they decide to become a faculty member, and trying to work out, how do you balance that telling the reality and the truth without discouraging them to go for something that's challenging and where there may be gender equity. Again, so many young women are looking at motherhood and going, I don't want that. That sucks. My mom's exhausted and not respected. So how do we bridge that truth without being discouraging?
I think if we tell them the truth, it isn't discouraging, because we give them the tools to overcome it. That's one piece. And then I'll talk about the other piece. We do girls and women a disservice when we don't tell them the truth, because then they do walk into those situations and say, wait a second, what's wrong with me? And there's nothing wrong with them. I think we do a disservice to girls and women when we say, if you work hard and do well in school, you can be anything you want to be. And that's only half of the story. I'll give you one example, and then I'll talk about the other piece of fixing that. In the United States, women are 58% of college graduates, 47% of the labor base, and just over 10% of the Fortune 500 CEOs. How can we reasonably tell women and girls that if they work hard and do well in school, they can be anything they want to be, without telling them the other half of how they actually get there? Because we have gaps at every stage. So we've got a 9-point gap between college education and labor force participation. And then we have a 37-point gap between labor force participation and actual CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And if you look at the data, for instance, to become a CEO, you generally have to have P&L responsibility. And what's interesting about that is that gender diverse sales teams actually far outperform their gender diverse peers. Whether or not people care about gender equity or even believe that it's an issue, it's actually a massive economic opportunity. CEOs and senior leadership are leaving money on the table by not ensuring, for instance, that their sales teams up and down that corporate ladder are gender diverse. But the other piece, the way, which is what Pipeline does, that we interrupt this, is to shift the system from inequitable by default to equitable by design. So in my past life as a senior leader in global 500 and Fortune 500 companies, obviously I was very committed to equity, but I had to choose to be equitable. That's a very different mindset then if the system is equitable by default, and I'll give you an example of that. So with Pipeline, what we do is intercept HR decisions across the 5 pillars of talent. So it's the 5 main buckets of decision-making: internal hiring, pay, performance, potential, and promotion. So as a manager, when you write a performance review, it goes through the Pipeline system. We use natural language processing to read through those performance reviews, call out any bias phrases, and then calibrate the ratings themselves. So if I receive a recommendation because the system has found some inequity, I can certainly reject that recommendation, but now I may well be choosing to be inequitable. And that is a very different decision-making model. And that's why we actually see on average companies improve equity by 67% in the first 3 months on the Pipeline platform.
Great. So I'm glad you went and explained that too. I was really struck by what you said about by default, not design, because I think we forget that so many of these things are just happening without us being intentional about them. Because it's the same when we think about our remote workplaces. If they're not intentionally designed to be equitable for all, they will not be. And again, if you haven't thought of it ahead of time and actually been intentional about that, I think that's so important. But then on the choice side that you're speaking about here is actually choosing to be inequitable. It's quite a different decision.
You bet. It's interesting. I actually wrote an article in 2020 for the World Economic Forum about that very topic. And there's a couple of things that are typically talked about in the narratives around women, like in the media, like on television and social media, et cetera, which are inadequate and miss a lot of women that actually participate in the labor force. So the sort of common narrative that was being thread around what is now hybrid work, but at the time was this move to remote work, was that by default, it would be more equitable because it was more flexible. And that if we were more flexible, we would actually have more women in the workforce. That is not by any stretch the full story. What we know is that I always used to say, if you give me equity of opportunity, just give me more opportunity, I can pay for my flexibility. That's one. Like, I don't need someone to manage my flexibility for me. But the other 2 pieces of that is that with remote work, we can have more bias because there is a proximity bias that happens. So managers who have direct reports who are closer to them, let's say in a hybrid environment, or are working with them more directly, those folks who are seen more often are more likely to be promoted and to be given development assignments. And so that leaves out women for the most part. That shows up in their performance reviews as well. And we know, for instance, from Pipeline's implementations that about 1/3 of all performance reviews contain bias, and 4% of the time that leads to women receiving lower ratings. And while that might not seem like a lot, modeled out, that 4% means that it takes women twice as long to be promoted into the same role. And then the last piece is that if you experience inequity at work, which probably 9 out of 10 of us are going to do that anyway, and I'll tell you where I got that number, it's harder to speak up at a distance. And the reason why I said 9 out of 10 is that 9 out of 10 of us actually have bias. And so experiencing bias is certainly dependent on your demographic, but having it isn't. Women are just as biased as men against women. And so we have to understand that. The other piece of that missing narrative are folks like me, which is that in the United States, 40% of US households with children under the age of 18, moms are the breadwinners. And there are 16 million breadwinner moms, and they support 28 million children. And the reason, one of the things we have is this myth of secondary income, that women's wages, their earnings, are for purses and shoes. They're not for things like housing and healthcare and transportation and food. And that is the other piece of that we think that women can choose not to work. And that's actually not true for 71% of households in the United States.
And I think that term that you use, breadwinner mom, is such a great way to step into that and message something really different from the beginning of any conversation. And I'm so glad that Pipeline does focus on performance, because when I was looking at the reasons for what causes burnout, one of the big ones is lack of reward. And so that's where I started to look into those statistics about promotional opportunities and rates. And then again, the maternal wall and the motherhood penalty. But I think even simple things that I was fascinated to learn about was self-appraisals, how problematic they are, because a woman is going to tend to underrate herself, a man is going to tend to overrate himself. The manager trying to look at this helps the woman come up a little bit, brings the man down a little bit, but actually the inequality remains anyway. So I was fascinated by that process, where the recommendation was, don't do self-appraisals. They're not going to be helpful. So tell us, you mentioned natural language processing that you use. What are some of the other tools?
Yeah. So I will answer that in just a second, but I do want to comment on the whole self-appraisal piece, because if someone has ever said to themselves, like, I want a woman to be president, but just not that woman, congratulations, you have bias. You got to check yourself on that stuff. And the issue with self-appraisals is that if I've written down everything I've accomplished and I've backed it up with documentation, the chances are for women that will say, who does she think she is? We really like women to be the damsels in distress in need of saving. This is the issue with allies and allyship. It's also the issue with folks going out and saying, he has a daughter, he must believe in equity. I'm like, does he have a wife? Because if he believes in equity for his wife, that's a very different thing. And also, because the majority of all men in leadership in large corporations are white, that leaves out all women of color. And so we have to be really careful about how we're structuring things to ensure that we're really addressing the core issue and designing for equity. So one of the things that we found, and this is particularly relevant given all the pay transparency laws that have recently gone into effect, we have found that you can't close the gender pay gap by starting with pay. And the reason is that pay is the symptom, it's not the disease. So in other words, pay is the quantitative value that companies place on their talent, but the actual value happens before that in performance and potential. So we have a product that we call Pay Suite. And when companies come to us in wanting to solve their pay gap, what we do is we don't start with pay. We actually start with performance. So the natural language processing, taking the bias out of the performance reviews, ensuring equitable ratings, and then ensuring equitable potential ratings, because we tend to judge women on their past performance, not their future potential. And so what that means is if you're using a 9-box method to rate your talent for future potential and development, develop them to be the senior leaders in the organization, they're unlikely or less likely to be the top right box, right? And we judge men based on their future potential. That's another piece. And those then become inputs to pay. And for pay, what we actually do is create cohorts, and then we have modifiers off of those cohorts. So for instance, if you and I were in the same job, our equitable pay range may be different because of our years of experience, because of where we live and our education, all sorts of different variables, including our performance and potential ratings.
Thank you so much for explaining so many of those things, because again, that potential is the thing that seems to be weighed in favor of men, and even when there's equal performance. And so that's what the research shows. And again, like you said, women are equally bad at giving men more potential than women. And I think back to what you said about not that woman is the president, is again, we have this research showing that women cannot both be likable and competent at the same time. So there's that bias that comes in. And then I think also you highlighted that we are penalized if we self-promote. And like you vaguely mentioned, you're also penalized when you negotiate.
I was going to say, that's one of the biggest myths that we have around women in the workforce is negotiation. Women don't negotiate as often as men. Yes, they do. The research shows that they negotiate the same amount as men. The difference is that they don't win. as often. And when they do negotiate, there's a negative connotation. There's a negative perspective and view of that woman because it's like, who does she think she is?
Yeah, there are so many challenges. So that's my next question then. You have these tools and these solutions, but what are the barriers to companies even approaching you in the first place? Or even when you're working with companies, what is it that they're still putting up in resistance to actually choosing to be equitable rather than inequitable?
Yeah. So, the issue around intersectional gender equity, so gender plus race, ethnicity, and age, isn't awareness, it's execution. And when I say that, what I mean is that 96% of CEOs put equity in their top priorities. The issue is that only 22% of employees regularly see it shared and measured. So you have a 74-point gap between what CEOs say is important, what employers use as their branding, and the actual employee experience. This was actually my experience as well. Both the companies where I fought to be paid equitably were regarded, and in some cases, award-winning for their commitment to diversity. And yet, I wasn't paid equitably. And what we have to do is focus on execution. And that is, just as one example, we've found that there are 3 key decisions that companies make across their talent each year, which is performance, potential, and pay. And the average Fortune 500 company has 60,000 employees. So that's 180,000 opportunities to move toward equity each and every year. That's what we make possible. The other piece of that is that we actually measure it in terms of additional revenue. So Pipeline started with research. We started with research across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in intersectional gender equity, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue. And so in our system itself, we actually measure, as you're making more equitable decisions, how is that actually improving your revenue?
Once again, I love that you're bringing so many statistics to this as well to make it so clear. And again, we see that from behavior change perspective, awareness is not enough. Yes, in some cases, awareness is one of the first steps that people have to make, but then there actually has to be the intention to do something, and the gap then between intention and action is like the Grand Canyon, is how I described it. So if people then don't have the confidence or the skills or the tools to cross that gap and actually then do something about it, that's really problematic. So I agree, that's where companies and systems and tools like Pipeline is bringing is so important. There is somewhat that excuse of, we don't know what to do. And I don't think it's we don't know what to do, we don't know how to do it. But I still hear we don't know what to do. And it's so frustrating. But I think on the other side of that too is, like you say, this awareness leaves us with branding and pledges. And recently there was the same process of companies pledging to become Thrive companies for mental health. And I kept writing to everyone that signed that pledge and say, what are you doing? Do you have a plan? Can you share your plan with me so that I can give you feedback on whether it's going to actually make any change? And that was just so frustrating because these pledges and commitments do get people awards.
Yeah. What's interesting, the other piece about that is, if awareness was going to solve the issue, it would have already solved it. And what I mean by that is that companies, one of the top interventions, if you will, or solutions that companies use to move toward gender equity is implicit bias training. So each and every year, companies spend $8 billion on implicit bias training. That's direct costs. That's not the indirect costs of taking employees out of the field, et cetera. And here, what the research shows is that implicit bias training, not only does it not work in closing the equity gap, it actually can make it worse. And the reason is that it reinforces stereotypes. What is it like to be a woman? What is it like to be a Black man, et cetera? And so we need to shift towards solutions that are both effective, but also cost efficient. such as things like pipeline, such as technology. If you can actually ensure that the decisions you're already making, that you're already going to be making across your talent are equitable, that's a very key way to shift your entire workforce to equity.
And I think the other thing with implicit bias training is when people are in this sort of mindset of, now I know, I fixed myself, I don't need to do anything, it was all in my head. And then they actually start doing less because they're like, oh, it was about my mindset, not about the actions I took every day to protect or to support other people. And also, I read some of the research showing one of the groups that maybe benefits from that is when Black women see what they're up against in organizations, when they realize, oh my goodness, these are all the biases I am fighting against, then they sometimes can start to realize, okay, I need to advocate for myself. Because like we started with, they see the truth of the barriers they're up against and go, okay, I now realize what I've got to overcome. It's just, again, very frustrating. That is what the money is being spent on, and that we haven't moved into this. And I think that the technology examples that you give are so important, because that was when I really also started to understand that by design was the example from Iris Burnett, that basically we think about not everybody is going to support, say, for example, environmental benefits. But for example, if we're in a hotel room and it's a key card that turns the lights on or not, and when we leave the room, we take away the key card, we're not making a choice to save electricity. We're just pulling the key card out and going about our day. That's how it was designed for us to be. So I think that's where, again, technology can be so supportive in these design processes, because we may not convince everybody to care about this, but if it's built into the system, then it's by default.
And I'll give you one additional example. So I know there's a lot of talk about climate change. I've talked about climate change as a gender equity issue, but we'll set that aside for the moment. One of the key ways where climate solving for sustainability really took off was when it became cost efficient. So I travel a lot. I spend a lot of time in hotels and on airplanes. And hotels will tell you, okay, they put the little signs up, if you don't, it's better for the environment if you don't wash your towels every day, et cetera, et cetera. It's also more cost efficient for the hotels because they don't have to spend time on hot water. They don't have to spend time on replacing your towels, et cetera. So there's a lot of cost efficiencies that actually come out of being sustainable. And that's the very same thing as gender equity. So one of the examples that I've used in people that are really well-intended, but the impact is negative, that is, they think they believe in gender equity, but it's still this damsel in distress approach, and is when Senator Elizabeth Warren suspended her presidential campaign, a reporter asked her if it was because of sexism. And she said, that's a trick question, because if I say yes, I sound like a whiner. And if I say no, about 1 billion women on this planet will say, what planet are you from? And so we have to understand this double bind of what it's actually like to speak up and how difficult that actually is.
So that's such a perfect segue into my next question, because I know you've made people aware very much through your advocacy and work about the political process and having women candidates. So what have you learned about advocacy in your work, going beyond the tools you're providing for organizations, and how do you give others hope?
A couple pieces. One is that the question isn't whether or not we can achieve gender equity. We absolutely can. The question is whether or not we'll choose to. Every time we make a people decision, there's 30 million employees in the Fortune 500. That's 90 million opportunities each and every year for us to move toward equity. It's within our power to actually make that a reality. That's the question, is whether or not we will actually choose to. In the public policy realm, specifically, we often think that public policy is gender neutral, and it isn't. It's gender ignorant. And that's both for men and women. And some examples of that, climate change is certainly one of them. Women are 80% of all climate change refugees, yet we represent only 25% of the voices that are in the room. 2 years after Hurricane Katrina, 83% of single moms could not return to their homes. Where were their voices in climate change conversations? Just as one example, during the pandemic in the United States, when we sent out stimulus checks to families, we didn't account for the fact that if you are a breadwinner mom who is unmarried and you have 2 children, your costs are not that much less than if you are a married breadwinner mom with 2 children. And yet the difference in what the stimulus that we sent out was about $1,200. And we also didn't account for the fact that not only are the costs not that much different, but there's less money coming into women's wallets. We did a research study and found that for breadwinner moms, they have, as a cohort, they have the largest gender pay gap of any women in the workforce. It's 66 cents on the dollar. And so we're not accounting for those things in actually ensuring that whatever money we are spending, we're ensuring it's being spent equitably. There is hope. For instance, our neighbor to the north, Canada, they use a gender mainstreaming approach, which is essentially applying the gender lens to all public policy issues. During the 2019 presidential primaries, I had the opportunity to interview President Biden. He was obviously a candidate at that point, and he committed to this, which is really applying the gender lens to all public policy decisions. And in Canada, it's called GBA, Gender Budgeting Analysis. And Hawaii has this as a state as well. They apply the gender lens to ensure that whatever decisions they're making, they're actually ensuring equity for men, women.
Yeah, and I think that's a great principle, but we don't know what are the consequences that we don't see, as long as it's got to have been done with such an analytic lens to it too. Because, for example, in universities, there's a gender neutral policy around being able to delay your tenure clock for promotion if you become a mum or a dad. And the advantage is in that year, the dads are publishing more on their research and doing better, and the mums are breastfeeding and not doing research. So actually that gender neutrality ends up leading to worse disparities. But again, these are things that everyone has such a great idea for what it's going to be, and they're thinking equity in the process, right? But the results, the outcomes are not equitable. So do they have those sort of feedback loops to ensure that?
They do. Yeah, absolutely. That's part of the gender budgeting analysis. Before any money is sent out, that's what they do. I mean, they've got a process by which they do that. I will say that we often confuse equality with equity. You're talking about leave as an example. And what I mean by that is there's a couple ways to explain the difference. But one is that if you and I, and let's say another person we know, we're trying to look over a fence and the 3 of us are all different heights, equality gives us the same height box to look over the fence, irrespective of our height and the height of the fence. Equity gives us different height boxes relative to our height and the height of the fence, so that the result is we can all look over the fence. The other example to explain the difference is really that we don't all have the same starting line. So if you have ever heard of an impact walk or an inclusion walk, if we all start on the same starting line and a facilitator calls out different circumstances that we faced, we were raised by a single mom, our parents went to college, our parents didn't go to college, our parents are immigrants. Once you go through all those questions and you see where everyone actually is, you can see those different starting lines. And having a starting line in front of other people, in other words, what we call privilege, doesn't mean that you don't deserve or didn't earn your place. It simply means that you started out farther ahead. And so what we need to do is to ensure that we are closing that gap for everyone else behind you.
Thanks so much for listening today. I hope the podcast brings you fresh ideas, renewed confidence, and energy to keep leading change. If you need a partner in these efforts, I can help you effectively build a thriving workplace culture for all. I'll help you overcome the real barriers to change you face every day and help you lead real change with evidence-based solutions. In particular, I want to work with passionate leaders who have tried and failed, because I know you have what it takes, and your experience will help you clearly recognize the difference I can make. For a free consultation today, please visit my website at www.leading-real-change.com. That's www.leadingrealchange.com.
Take control, you're a fighter. Push the limits and see it, you're already there. Told you we going higher. Ain't no stopping us, we're going in for the win. And we're gonna celebrate. Then we're gonna do it all over again. And we're gonna rock this place, 'cause this is our day. We're gonna do it together, through any weather, rain, sleet, storm or hell. We're gonna prove it together, move it together. There's no option to fail. We're gonna do it together, through any weather, rain, sleet, storm or hell. We're gonna prove it together, move it together. There's no option to fail. Close your eyes, feel the power.